Oars has been name-dropped a couple of times during the Elbaf arc already, which kind of stands out when you consider how Oda tends to handle referencing characters that we'll see again in the future. He usually doesn't repeat things unless there's a payoff coming, or at least a shift in how we're supposed to see someone. So the fact that Oars keeps coming up, and the growing focus on giants who carry ancient giant blood, makes you wonder if we're being set up for something, maybe even a flashback. One that could reframe who Oars really was and what role he played in Elbaf's past. And that's what I want to talk about today, so let's get into it. Like I said before, we're getting more stuff about the ancient giant tribe, especially the attention to the visual marker of horns, which seems to appear in both Oars and other descendants of the ancient giant tribe. Harold, the king who tried to lead Elbaf towards peace, actually cut his horns off. A bold move, considering most people just, go to therapy, but okay. He saw them as a reminder of a violent legacy, one he didn't want to carry forward, but that might have been his own way of dealing with the past. That kind of passed down narrative, especially one that paints Oars as a symbol of chaos, it feels like it might be doing more than just preserving memory. It could just be shaping identity, because in a place like Elbaf where tradition runs deep, a figure like Oars might serve as a kind of cautionary tale. Not necessarily because every giant agrees with that interpretation, but because it's the version that's easiest to maintain. Basically, Oars is like Elbaf's version of just don't end up like this guy. But that framing might not be coming from Elbaf alone. If anything, it seems like this version of Oars, the monster, the thing to be feared, the devil, may benefit the world government more than anyone else, especially when you think about how their long-standing pattern of rewriting history serves their interest. There's a chance that Oars wasn't just remembered this way by accident. Maybe his legacy was shaped to discourage future giants from following in his footsteps, whatever those footsteps actually looked like. And the more I sat with it, the more it started to feel like Oars might not have been the threat that we were told he was. It's hard to say what he actually believed in or what kind of life he lived. The fact that we know so little about his intentions kind of raises more questions than answers. Like, why is his legacy so one-dimensional? Why is it all destruction and none of the context? And why is it only now in Elbaf that his name keeps resurfacing? And there's a chance that Oars wasn't a symbol of chaos at all. Like, maybe he was someone who dreamed too big, or just trusted the wrong people, or got caught up in something much larger than himself. And maybe the reason his story was flattened into some kind of warning was because someone wanted it that way. Whether it was Elbaf trying to forget or the world government trying to control the narrative, so far right now, currently, it's hard to say, but either way, I kind of feel like we're finally being invited to take a second look. I think that story matters a lot because Elbaf isn't just a warrior culture, it's one that's deeply shaped by legends and myths. They're not just used for entertainment, they're practically identity to Elbaf. And when a society filters its history through that kind of storytelling, I think it would become harder to tell where, memory ends and narrative begins. So if the tale of Oars has been handed down more like a fable than a fact, then there's a chance it was never meant to preserve this truth. It was meant to make a point. And that becomes especially relevant now given what we're seeing in the present. The world government through the God's Knights is basically speedrunning censorship on Elbaf, burning the books, closing the school, which isn't that distant from today's far-right political climate in the States. Huh. Holy shit. And if you look at the broader pattern in One Piece, the kind of cultural erasure isn't new. It's kind of how the world government works. It's not just by using force, but by deciding which stories are worth remembering and which ones need to disappear. We've seen this kind of thing before, places where the truth was buried so deeply that the story left behind started to feel like the only verse that ever existed. It happened with Nolan, whose legacy was just reduced to a meme. It happened with Joy Boy, whose name became myth, while his actual life and dream faded into mystery. And maybe it's happening again with Oars, not because he was forgotten, but because someone chose to remember him in a certain way. A version that felt safer, easier to control, more useful to the systems in power. You could argue that when a story starts functioning like that, less as history and more as a framework of ideas, it stops being about the person it was based on and it becomes something else entirely, a tool that tells people what not to be. And if that's the version of Oars that Elbaf or the world government has passed down, then maybe the story isn't wrong because it's exaggerated. Maybe it's wrong because it was never really about Oars to begin with. And maybe that's the part that matters the most, not what Oars did or didn't do, but how his story has been used. Whether by Elbaf or the world government or both, it seems like there is a version of him that was preserved specifically to serve someone else's vision and order. A version that warns against power or rebellion or unity, depending on who's telling it. And if that's the case, then learning the truth about Oars isn't just about reevaluating his character, it's about questioning the systems that decide which legacies get to live and which ones are quietly being repurposed. So when we ask what kind of person Oars really was, we might also be asking something else. Something a little harder to answer, like who benefits from the version we're given? And what might it mean if the truth, whatever it is, no longer fits the story that's been holding Elbaf together? The deeper thread tying Oars, the ancient giants, and King Harold together might not just be about lineage or legacy, it might be about how each of them in different ways ended up being shaped or even used by something larger. Because Harold believed that the ancient giants represented unchecked violence, and he tried to move Elbaf in the opposite direction. And cutting off his horns was his way of saying, we're not them anymore. But even with all that effort to distance himself from the past, it seems like he's still wound up in a similar position. If the rumors are true, or half true, there's a chance Harold cooperated with the world government, possibly agreeing to let Elbaf provide soldiers in exchange for protection. And if that's the case, then his pacifism may have been more fragile than it looked, because what that would mean is that he didn't reject the legacy of the ancient giants so much as redirected it toward the kind of service that the world government finds useful. Which makes you wonder, was he courted into repeating history under a new label? And what starts to emerge here is a kind of tragic parallel, one that stretches across generations. The ancient giants, including someone like Oars, might have once tried to unify their people or protect something worth preserving. But somewhere along the line, that intention may have been twisted. Maybe they were manipulated into a conflict that they didn't start. Maybe they were pushed into becoming the very thing others feared they would be. And once the violence came, it became easier to vilify them than to understand what actually happened. And their fall, if that's what it was, might have been what triggered the fragmentation of the giant tribes in the first place. And possibly in the aftermath, Elbaf rebuilt itself through a kind of internal control. Like it started drawing lines around who counted and who did it, and somewhere in that process, purity became policy. You could see it in how Hadruda's mother was treated. She was a giant, but she wasn't from Elbaf, and that made her blood unacceptable. Hadruda's denial of kingship isn't just a personal slight, it feels like the result of a society still trying to protect itself from something that it's too ashamed to name. A fear passed down like a story. And in chapter 1137, Road kind of says the quiet part out loud. He points out that humans do the same thing, fighting over land and resources like it's second nature. So Elbaf's bigotry isn't an isolated flaw, because it's part of a larger pattern Oda keeps drawing attention to. How people, whether giant or human, are taught to divide, to fear difference, and to weaponize myth as a justification for cruelty. And just like how the world government painted Ohara, they encourage such division because it makes control easier. This is what makes Hadruden's dream feel so radical, because he's not just pushing for political reform or just being a new king. He's challenging the very stories that shaped Elbaf's worldview. So if we do end up getting a flashback that shows Oars in a different light, that he wasn't a monster, that the tribes were divided through manipulation, that the purity doctrine was built on a lie, then Elbaf won't just be facing its past, it'll be forced to confront its own role in keeping that past buried. And maybe that's what makes this arc feel so heavy beneath the surface, because if the truth does come out, it doesn't just free Elbaf from its shame. It kind of demands that the rest of the world asks itself what it chose to forget too. A huge example, the Void Century. If the Elbaf arc continues on its current trajectory, then all signs point toward a deeper reveal. One that re-examines how the giants were divided, who Oars really was, and why Elbaf became so obsessed with purity and isolation. A flashback to Oars in his prime could serve as the narrative turning point that forces Elbaf to confront its past. Not just the violent parts, but the manipulation behind it. And maybe that's where the Land of Ice comes back into play. The detail about Oars dying there, frozen, nearly butt naked and alone. We've known about this for a long time since Thriller Bark, but it's never really been given context. Like, why would someone that powerful end up there in the first place? Was it exile? And again, Hadruden becoming the first leader of a new Elbaf would be huge. It might be the first step toward healing a culture that's been fractured for centuries. Maybe that's what this arc is circling. Not erasing the past, but finally reclaiming it. Anyways, maybe Oars wasn't a monster after all, and if Elbaf is really about to confront the truth that it's been running from, then that might not just change how we see the giants, it might completely change how we see Robin's role in this arc too. And if that idea interests you, I actually go deeper into it in this video here.